Trouble with names. One issue that becomes an issue when we talk about the Civil War is, what do we call the battles? One thing that may confuse a great many people when they research this war is the fact that many of these battles seem to have multiple names. Why exactly is the Battle of Bull Run and the First Battle of Manassas the same thing? Well, the reason is Union commanders tended to name battles for the nearby rivers. So, for example, the Battle of Bull Run was so called because it occurred near Bull Run Creek. Confederate commanders tended to name the battles after the nearby town. So, First Battle of Manassas because it occurred nearby the town of Manassas. Alright, there we go. Now, Battle of Bull Run, also called Battle of Manassas or Battle of First Manassas. The Union Army got outflanked by the Confederate forces pouring in from across the Confederacy. This battle saw the career of several famed Confederate generals, including Stonewall Jackson, so named because of his habit of, him and his soldiers formed a tight line on one of the hills, which many recall as being a stone wall. Now, one interesting fact is that the Union Army, after being outflanked, retreats toward D.C. It is actually remarked that if the Confederate Army had pursued the Union Army and chased them back to the national capital, they likely could have forced the end of the war that same week. The war would have ended with a Confederate victory. However, the Union lost the battle, because the Confederacy ultimately refused to press their advantage. Instead, Confederate soldiers spent the time looting abandoned Union supplies. Now, in the earliest days of the war, the Union adopts a strategy known as the Anaconda Plan. So named because the strategy involved essentially a giant siege of the South. So as you know from our time looking at sectionalism, the South was primarily a cash crop region. So most of their economic focus is on producing non-edible crops like tobacco, cotton, indigo, and selling those products abroad. Rice, particularly, admittedly was edible, but most of their other products were not edible. In order to get the necessities of life, most of their foodstuffs, as well as most of their manufactured goods, were imported either from Europe or from the North. So, one classic strategy then became, well, if we can isolate the South, if we can cut it off from trade, maybe that will eventually force them into submission. So the Union Navy occupied the southern ports on the Atlantic. They would isolate the Confederacy from European aid and trade by, again, putting a blockade across the eastern Atlantic as well. So, Union ships plied the Gulf of Mexico as well as the coastline, designed to keep the Confederacy from getting in food, manufactured goods, or weapons from Europe or anywhere else in the world. It also cuts off the flow of supplies, equipment, etc. It also prevents the South from exporting its cotton, which is the source of its income. So now the South cannot use its cotton to acquire money. They would control the Mississippi River to the west using Union gunboats. Shallow-hulled boats with many cannons mounted on them, which served to control the river. At this point, the Mississippi also helped by dividing the eastern and western portions of the Confederacy. So states like Texas and Louisiana were cut off from states like Virginia and Georgia. By so doing, it would divide and conquer. The next plan was to capture the cities of New Orleans, Vicksburg, and Memphis, the major cities, and to cut off shipping to and from the interior. By doing this, by controlling these trade routes, you prevent the interior of the Confederacy, where many crops could be grown and many resources developed, from being able to share those with the major coastal cities. This plan then would involve, ultimately the goal was a sort of siege mentality. You would surround them, cut them off from the outside world, and this would eventually exhaust their resources and force them to surrender. It got its name the anaconda plant after the fact that anacondas, as a type of boa constrictor, kill their prey by constricting it, by wrapping themselves around it and crushing it to death. And the Civil War saw the birth of new forms of technology. These included ironclad warships, rifling, cannons with rifling and exploding shells, hot air balloons, percussion caps, and even biological warfare. So let's talk about the Monitor and the Merrimack. This is called the Battle of Hampton Roads, and it occurred in a river in Virginia. Now, specifically the James River, being more specific. Now, this battle pitted two ironclad war vessels, some of the earliest ironclad war vessels ever developed. These were the USS Monitor, a specially developed Union ironclad, versus a more improvised Confederate ironclad known as the CSS Virginia, formerly a non-armored gunboat known as the USS Merrimack. Now, the battle was a draw. Neither side won. The reason for this tie was the fact that neither ship's cannons could actually penetrate the other vessel's iron armor. So essentially, the Monitor and the Merrimack shot each other a good deal of the time, but the cannonballs from both ships were not sufficient to puncture the hulls of these vessels through their ironclad armor. Now, to us, as moderns, this battle may seem a bit unenthusiastic. After all, to this day, we have a multitude of, most of our vessels are metal. But if you remember that ironclad vessels were a new invention at the time. Furthermore, there's the issue that during the Civil War, much of the American military was observed by foreign military dignitaries. It is hard to contemplate the fear that these foreign observers had at the sight of the Monitor and Merrimack duel, because in one instance they saw the simple truth that entire navies were rendered obsolete. Both ships were nearly unstoppable in this battle when faced against wooden warships, and could only be matched by fellow ironclads. As a result of this, it demonstrated that many of the nations of the world which had built up fleets of wooden war vessels suddenly woke up to discover this day that their entire navies had just become technologically obsolete. Rifling. So firearms possess grooves inside the barrel of the gun. That's what we call rifling. It enables the bullet to spin when exiting the gun. This is the device called a mini ball, which is a small bullet, which basically resembles a modern bullet, as you would see. It has that roughly cone-shaped, that conical sort of shape about it. Now, the result of this was a bullet that spun rather like a modern football does. And this spiral made these guns well more accurate by half than what their predecessors had been. The flintlock muskets of the War of 1812 and the Revolution paled in comparison to these longer-range rifles. Suddenly, close to distances in excess of a mile could suddenly be spanned with a gunshot with relative accuracy, whereas prior to this, muskets were limited to a range of less than 100 yards. This increase, of course, spelled absolute chaos in the military world, because suddenly musket-based military techniques became obsolete. Firing in long rows and volleys, which were convenient and useful when guns had barely any accuracy, became absolute bloodbaths in this age of rifled gunfire. Quickly, we see armies developing versions of trench warfare, where soldiers would end up hunkering down behind massive earthen walls and then peeking out from behind them when possible to fire upon the enemy. This development leads to the rise of sharpshooters, a type of early sniper. They were routinely used to assassinate rival commanders. For example, there are legends of men like Robert E. Lee in particular wearing a common soldier's uniform, and many like to claim that, it was a sign of his humility. He didn't want to wear anything as flashy or ostentatious. He simply wanted the uniform of a plain soldier, despite being an accomplished general. However, it's important to note that many claim this may actually have been a camouflage against snipers. By not dressing in any obvious regalia, it would make it harder for a sharpshooter to spot which man was the commanding officer. Percussion caps. Guns of this period also had a new firing mechanism. These percussion caps would explode, if sorts or ignite, when struck by the gun's external hammer. So the hammer would come down. The hammer, which is shown right over here, this is the hammer, would come down and strike the percussion cap, which ignited the gunpowder and propelled the bullet out the gun. Now, this was an improvement over the earlier military techniques, which used flint, which was less reliable. Artillery. Mortars increased in size and became much bigger, as you can see from the illustration at the bottom of this page. Many cannons were equipped with rifling to make their bullet-shaped shells, which had gunpowder charges, more accurate. We also see some early versions of breech-loading cannons emerge, cannons that could be loaded from the back. This, of course, allowed artillerymen to not have to draw cannons back behind fortified lines when reloading, or not having to expose themselves to as much enemy fire when reloading the cannons. We also have reconnaissance. For the first time, we see aircraft. Hot air balloons were used by the Union Army to scout out Confederate positions. These airmen would fly up into the air on the hot air balloons and could observe Confederate positions and troop movements from above. We also see an early experiment in biological warfare. The Confederacy attempted to spread yellow fever, a basically a very deadly ailment that was spreading around the South. They attempted to spread to the North. Now, this plan failed in large part because the Confederate strategy was to take clothes from those who had recently died of yellow fever, pack them into luggage trunks on trains bound for northern cities, such as Washington, D.C. Ultimately, the trains were intercepted, and also, it's worth noting that this wouldn't have worked out anyway, because of the fact that, unlike many diseases, yellow fever is not spread through bacteria that remain on clothes or on the skin, but rather that live inside the gut of mosquitoes. As a result, it is the bite of infected mosquitoes that spread yellow fever, not exposure to the possessions of the deceased. So with our discussion of biological warfare, I'm going to end our discussion on the Civil War for today. Tune in next class as we continue the discussion of this frightful and interesting period in American